It's a tune inspired by some writing of Blake's, which I'll say more about later on. Dante, Blake, Eternity and Time, an interactive presentation on the 3rd anniversary of Sangharakshita's death. This is me, Satchalila, re-recording the first section of this because it didn't get recorded originally. So I have an introduction before I launch in, where I wanted to say something about call and response. I've called this an interactive presentation, so I wanted to make that invitation explicit, that you are invited to interact with this. We could see the whole of the Dharma life as a process of call and response. Manjushra once wrote a haiku about the Buddha. Something called to him, repeated over and over, and he noticed. Something called to him, repeated over and over, and he noticed. The Buddha heard or saw, sensed or intuited something, and he noticed. He heard and he responded, eventually by going forth on the noble quest. We could say that when he did that, what he did after that, after enlightenment, was to send out calls through his being, through his presence, through his utterances and teachings, and that the Sangha came into being when the 5 ascetics responded to his call. Why am I saying all this? It's to do with the topic that we touched on in our first Arts Cafe afternoon last week, about arts and individuality. The arts can have a transforming effect on our consciousness. They can take us out of the little self-referent bubble of ego identification into a much bigger, brighter, clearer, open and more sensitive world, if we can be receptive. And if the work that is affecting us comes from that more expanded state of consciousness. It's about receptivity and response. Receptivity does not mean passivity. True receptivity is a very active thing. The energy of a person or an idea or an image comes into our awareness and it has an effect. Whether we like it or not, whether we notice or not, there is a response. And becoming aware of our actual honest responses to things is a vital part of Dharma practice. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood, storming out to play through the broken dike. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail, but if one gets lost, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs, but not to recognize the fact. And so I appeal to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool ourselves, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes, or no, or maybe should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. This poem is by the American poet William Stafford. The signals we give, yes, or no, or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world. And following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. So you are a very important half of what happens this afternoon or whenever you're listening to this. Your responses matter. It matters that your responses are authentic, whether you love something or hate it, whether you're puzzled by it, comfy with it, or just utterly indifferent. We need to learn to become aware of what we actually think and feel and live in a way that is true to that. And that was something very important to Blake and very important to Bhante Sangharakshita. Authenticity, individuality, knowing your own mind, making conscious choices, aware of the consequences of our actions, that our life is the creation of our mind. Sangharakshita wrote in the Mosley Miscellany, Blake was quite aware that he was original, but he did not seek to be original. He was original because he was true to his own experience and his own spiritual vision. That is at the heart of the importance of Blake's significance to Sangharakshita, that Blake was utterly faithful to and true to his own experience, his own spiritual vision. So this afternoon, or whenever you're listening to this, you can just sit back and let it all wash over you. Or you can pick up a pen or a brush or whatever you fancy and get into dialogue with what you're hearing, seeing, experiencing. That's a much more effective way to engage with the Dharma. Become conscious of your response, argue with it, rail against it, express your delight for it, your love for it. William Blake filled the margins of his books with notes. He had arguments with the authors that he read. And all these writings are preserved now. They're part of his complete works. His thinking was partly forged in opposition, in tussle with those thinkers, those minds, those books that he encountered. And the same is true of Sangharakshita. So the sessions for this afternoon have been planned in 3 parts. Each part will have some input like this, then about 15 minutes when you can write, draw, sit and reflect, and then some time to come together with space to share and discuss any questions. And there are 3 sections to our time together this afternoon. The first is about the golden string, the second about the marriage of heaven and hell, and the third about the fourfold vision and the Mandala of awakening. But first of all, who is William Blake? I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, set in Jerusalem's wall. This is one of Blake's own images of loss, embodiment of imagination, holding a light, going through a doorway into the darkness. We could also see this as an image of Blake himself, that guide into those inner worlds that he explored with painting, poetry. But who was he? Blake lived in London from 1757 to 1827. He was a painter, a poet, an engraver, and he made his own illuminated books. He was very influenced by the alternative traditions of religion, like the dissenters, as well as by alchemy, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, the Western mystery tradition, He was relatively unknown in his lifetime, and he made his living as an artisan engraver, engraving other people's work. But from the late 19th century onwards, his work and his renown have grown and grown. He's influenced a huge range of artists, musicians, and other creatives, and he's probably more famous now than he's ever been. I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, set in Jerusalem's wall. Heaven, Jerusalem. You may be familiar with this verse, or you may be thinking, what the hell's this got to do with the Dharma? Heaven, Jerusalem. So, welcome to the world of myth and imagination, where our greatest danger and foe is literalism. Bhante Sangharakshita once spoke about the Mara of literalism and the magic of metaphor. We'll have more to say about this later on. But meanwhile, I'll just say that heaven in Buddhism is a different way of describing more expanded states of consciousness, an awareness that is broader, deeper, and higher than our everyday way of seeing and perceiving. In Jerusalem, well, she is an important part of Blake's mythology we will also encounter later. Suffice it to say, she is a mythical embodiment of a place which can be seen as the culmination of all paths. And of course, there's the hymn Jerusalem, but that's another story. You don't have to believe in God to be able to benefit from Blake's visions and imagery. In fact, Blake's own sense of God is rather different to the conventional one. He said, "The vision of Christ that thou dost see is my vision's greatest enemy." Let's just say that all is not as it may appear when you hear Blake talking about God, Jesus, Jerusalem. Hold it lightly and playfully, like brightly coloured balls, as Bhante says of concepts in the Three Jewels. So, this golden string. I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, set in Jerusalem's wall. It's a way of describing the starting end of that experience, that sense, glimpse or call of something which we can get hold of and follow towards liberation, freedom, or eternity in Blake's terms. In other words, the end of the golden string is a way of describing a moment of vision, as in vision and transformation. The transformation is the long path of keeping on, following the thread once we've got hold of the end of it. Sometimes we drop it, but it's still there waiting for us to pick it up again. And the starting end of that thread, the glimpse, experience, taste, smell, sense of vision comes differently for each of us. Hence the importance of noticing and noting for future reference those moments of being, as Virginia Woolf called them, those openings, those experiences which tell us there's more to life than we previously thought. These are little glimpses of eternity in the Blakean sense. To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. And T.S. Eliot has that wonderful line, "To be conscious is not to be in time. To be conscious is not to be in time." In the last lecture of the Bodhisattva Ideal series, Sangharakshita talks of eternity as being outside of time and space, not an infinite prolonging of time. And this is very much how Blake thought of eternity. And as Bhante says in this wonderful talk, which I'd really recommend, It's impossible for our ordinary minds to conceive of what something is without using an image that brings us back to talk either in terms of space or time. We're just wired that way. Ultimately, we need to let go of identifying with a limited kind of consciousness that chops things up into time and space. This is all very tricky, but there is a spatial image which might be helpful along the way as we're trying to let go of time and space. Last autumn at Sangharakshita, I did a talk on mindfulness and insight. It's on YouTube if you want to catch it. And it was the last in our Life with Full Attention series. And I used an image of the egg of ignorance to describe the way in which our consciousness is limited by the wrong views that we have, including fixed ideas about space and time. It is as if we're trapped inside an egg whose shell is made of all our many views and perspectives. Adventitious defilements is the technical term, all layered over and obscuring the view of the sky beyond. Something makes a crack in the egg. Light, insight, bigger vision gets in. It's as if the end of the golden string pokes into the egg, through the eggshell, prods us awake, out of time into eternity. In fact, Blake himself spoke about the mundane egg, but that's another story. And it can be that there's an intuition from us that there's something more than is encased in this little egg, makes us struggle, crack, try and reach out beyond the egg. But sometimes it's something that comes crashing in, some shocking event, some death, some great loss, something very painful that cracks the egg from the outside. We didn't want it, it's suffering, but it opens us up. It opens us up to something more than this encased, enclosed, narrow experience of ourselves and the world. So Blake gives us this image of the golden string. Bhante tells us how important Blake is in his succinct but comprehensive essay, Buddhism and William Blake. Bhante says, Buddhism won't really spread in the West until it speaks the language of Western culture. It won't spread until it speaks the language of Western culture. Wherever the Dharma goes, it needs to learn to speak the language of the indigenous culture. And this will take time. But he goes on, we can hasten this process by bringing Buddhism into contact with those Western poets, thinkers, and mystics in whose life or work or both there's a reflection of something of the spirit of Buddhism in the language of Western culture. There's some reflection in them, some resonance in them with the spirit of the Dharma, but they're communicating in Western culture. Sangharakshita also says, one of the greatest of these winged spirits is the English poet, prophet, and visionary William Blake. So vision is where Bhante and Blake most strongly meet. He started to read Blake and he started to look at Blake images at the age of 13 or 14, per courtesy of Tooting Public Library, as he tells us, in a Mosley miscellany. And his fascination of Blake continued right up to the end of his life. Some of the final pieces that he wrote in the last couple of years before he died were very concerned with themes found in Blake. And in turn, they were partly inspired by the Blake retreats and exhibitions, which we'd started to run at Adhisthana. And Bhante was reading Blake before he read the Dhyana Sutra, before he read the Sutra of Huineng when he was 16. I have a sense that it's almost as if Blake's kind of in the DNA of Bhante's thinking. And it's partly that I wanted to have a go at sharing this afternoon. So in the two sections that follow this, we'll explore two more of the areas where Blake resonates strongly with Bhante's presentation of the Dharma. But for now, what we're going to do is stay with this image of the golden thread that can lead us beyond our limited perspective. I'll give you a final Blake quote. Then we'll have about 15 minutes to write or draw or reflect. Make marks on paper, whatever you want, or you don't have to do anything. You just need to know it's not possible to do it wrong. And you never have to show anybody unless you want to. It's not possible to do it wrong. You never have to show anyone unless you want to. Give yourself that. So just listen now with your whole being and see what response arises. And then after we've had some writing reflection time, there'll be time to ask questions and share anything we want to. So this Blake quote that I wanted to share with you. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall. What is our response to this? What is our response to the idea that we've encountered already the end of the golden string, a moment or moments of vision that have led us to this moment? Do we have a sense of what life might be like if the doors of perception were cleansed? Our doors of perception were cleansed. How do we find ourselves right now? Irritated? Content? Fascinated? Puzzled? We'll have time now to write, draw, reflect, just sit. And then we'll go on to the next section. So, we've been exploring the golden string. I give you the end of a golden string. Only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, set in Jerusalem's wall. Sounds quite simple, really, doesn't it? We have a glimpse, an experience, a taste, a call to something beyond our usual mundane experience. We decide to start following the golden thread towards that experience. And what happens? We encounter ourselves and our energies in all their wondrous, technicolor, contrary complexity. We aren't integrated. All the different aspects of ourselves don't want to pull in the same direction. And if we could move on and have a slide, which is the clod and the pebble. So, contraries. Love seeketh not itself to please, nor for itself hath any care, but for another gives its ease, and builds a heaven in hell's despair. So sung a little clod of clay, trodden with the cattle's feet, but a pebble of the brook warbled out these meters meet. Love seeketh only self to please, to bind another to its delight, joys in another's loss of ease, and builds a hell in heaven's despite. Love seeketh not itself to please, nor for itself hath any care, but for another gives its ease, and builds a heaven in hell's despair. So sung a little clod of clay trodden with the cattle's feet, but a pebble of the brook warbled out these meters meet. Love seeketh only self to please, to bind another to its delight, joys in another's loss of ease, and builds a hell in heaven's despite. So Blake famously said that without contraries is no progression.
He wrote songs of innocence and experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. And this poem, The Clod and the Pebble, it conveys both the innocence of aspiration, the experience of our deluded and conflicted energies. And in the book where Bhante met Blake when he was 15, he'd have seen this next image, if we could have the next slide, of the poem about the schoolboy. I love to rise in a summer morn when the birds sing on every tree. The distant huntsman winds his horn and the skylark sings to me. Oh, what sweet company! But to go to school on a summer morn, oh, it drives all joy away. Under a cruel eye outworn, the little ones spend the day in sighing and dismay. Ah, then at times I drooping sit and spend many an anxious hour, nor in my books can I take delight, nor sit in learning's bower, worn through with the weird dreary shower. How can a bird that is born for joy sit in a cage and sing? How can a child when fears annoy but droop his tender wing and forget his youthful spring? Oh, father and mother, if birds are nipped and blossoms blown away, and if the tender plants are stripped of their joy in the springing day, by sorrow and care's dismay, how shall the summer arise in joy, or the summer fruits appear? Or how shall we gather what griefs destroy, or bless the mellowing year, when the blasts of winter appear? So this is another of Blake's songs of experience that portrays quite graphically these contrary states, the joyful, youthful exuberance of unconstrained energy, and the effect of that being cooped up and sent to sit in a school all day. The opposition between those two kinds of energy occurs again and again in Blake, and it brings us to our next theme. So one of Blake's most famous works is called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and even the title can have a strong effect. Bhante said when he wrote that piece about Blake in the Mosley Miscellany that he copied the text of that book out in its entirety when he was about 14. He wrote it out by hand. And I asked him why once when I saw him, and he said, I was fascinated by the title. The title itself, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Heaven and hell, a way of describing vast energies of the contraries within us, within the world, which need somehow to be brought into relationship, to be married. There's an image in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and it appears later as well in Blake's life. It recurs through his life. If we could have the next slide. There's this image of this great swirling, curling snake full of energy, Leviathan. And yeah, the energy of the deeps. So this was an image from quite early on, well, relatively early on in Blake's life. And then if we have the next slide, this is the same image that he drew. You see the same curling, swirling snake, that's Leviathan at the bottom, and then above you've got the other great massive beast, Behemoth. And this is actually one of Sangharakshita's favourite Blake images. It was a painting Blake did towards the end of his life. And one commentator, Foster Damon, says they symbolise the immense powers of the subconscious mind, the unredeemed and warring portion of the psyche. What was great. The unredeemed and warring portion of the psyche. Like there's loads of energy there. And it's all there in the deeps. And let's have the next slide, because this is also quite graphic. Here we have, again, it's a different image of loss. So it's the same guy we saw in the hat going through the doorway. He's the archetype of the creative imagination, and he's a blacksmith. So he's at his anvil, but he's got this great black bird over him, which is Blake's depiction of the spectre. And I don't know about you, but I'm very familiar with this spectre. It's that one that comes and looms over you. I experience it loads when I'm doing that indexing, actually. The spectre kind of comes and goes, oh, what are you doing? You're doing a terrible job. Why did you start? No point. And you're trying to do something creative. And it's like, well, it's like Mara, isn't it? Or something. But Blake has this image of the spectre. It's this kind of, well, I probably don't need to say more, but this kind of oily, sounds so reasonable, just wants to block that creative energy. And again, you see these conflicting energies made into image by Blake, yeah? So if we have the next one, there's another different image of that spectre, this time over what looks like a corpse, yeah. So Blake himself, Bhante himself was no stranger to inner conflict. And again, he taught the Dharma, that the Dharma is a means of integration, unification of energies. It's the first stage in our system of practice. And I just wanted to share with you a short piece that Naga Bodhi wrote back in the last edition of Dharma Life in 2005, because it's always struck me. He was writing about Bhante in a way that illuminates both that big conflict within him, but also his uncompromising following of the golden thread in his life. So Naga Bodhi wrote, Bhante once admitted that if he hadn't found some object of commitment as worthy, as all-consuming, or as noble as the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, then the powerful and diverse forces of his nature would have ripped him apart. I honestly think I would have gone mad, he said. And he's written about the fundamental tension between Sangharakshita 1, the poet, the dreamer, the visionary, and Sangharakshita 2, the thinker, the scholar, the monk. And it is sometimes, but not always, possible to see the dynamic interplay of these and other forces in Sangharakshita. And Naga Bodhi goes on, but however he is manifesting, however he's behaving, my experience of him has been that his total uncompromising commitment to his mission of practicing and sharing the Dharma has never wavered. There's a golden thread. It's what his life has been about, pure and simple. And any attempts I've made to probe through the depths, workings, and motivations beneath or beyond that have brought me up against the same realization. He may be a complex individual, but he's found a way of channeling everything about him in the direction of his chosen goal. And you're missing him completely if you don't see that. So I just think that's a fascinating quote. And I think you can really, I can feel it quite physically as I'm describing it now. That resonance with Blake, these big energies at play, and then just really trying to make them into a creative endeavour. For Bhante, it was creating our order and movement, sharing the Dharma. And obviously for Blake, it's this amazing explosion of work. Bhante was utterly faithful to the golden thread of his vision. So it's interesting to reflect that the young Sangharakshita, Dennis, as he was then, saw, heard, responded to something in Blake's book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, his talk of the marriage of heaven and hell, and that stayed with him through his life. And as I say, we can see that reflected in the system of practice, which was something he discerned in the Buddhist tradition and represented to us, as he did with a number of teachings. And he emphasized the fact we need a vision from a higher, deeper, broader perspective within which to unify our energies. We need to not keep things out, but have a perspective that's big enough to bring in all the different energies that we have, to refocus them, if you like. And that we can stay connected with that vision by a kind of golden string. We can keep following through the path of transformation. So I thought to conclude this section on the marriage of heaven and hell, I'll just share with you one of my favourite sections from the marriage, well, not all of it, but some bits from one of my favourite sections in the marriage of heaven and hell. It's got the work, marriage of heaven and hell, is broken up into different sections. Memorable fancies, stories. There's one bit that's like a shamanic journey. There's a whole section explaining why all deities reside within the human breast. Anyway, there's a section called the Proverbs of Hell. And you'll probably have heard some of these, because some of them are quite famous. But I thought what I'd do is I'd drop a few in. You can see how they land. And then we'll segue into another chance to write. But this will be about a halfway point. So if you do want to take a leg stretch or something in that time, obviously you can do that. Grab some water. Yeah. So some Proverbs of Hell. Okay, are you ready? The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. A fool sees not the same tree that a wise man sees. A fool sees not the same tree that a wise man sees. Eternity is in love with the productions of time. Eternity is in love with the productions of time. I actually first heard that one from Vasantra quite a few years ago now. I was on a walk with him, and I said to him, because he's often talks about heart wish, and I said to Vasantra, what's your heart wish, Vasantra? And he said, eternity in love with the productions of time. I said, that's amazing. Did you make that up? I said, no, that was Billy Blake. Eternity is in love with the productions of time. Okay, another one. No bird soars too high if it soars with its own wings. No bird soars too high if it soars with its own wings. I really like this next one. If a fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. If a fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. I think that for me, it's like if you keep going so far in one direction, eventually you come round and you go, whoa, and you go the other way. Yeah. What about shame is pride's cloak? Shame is pride's cloak. That's a really good one to reflect on in terms of the precepts. Very interesting. Okay, one final one. You never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough. I'll say that again. You never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough. So just notice how you're responding. Are you delighted? Are you irritated? Are you puzzled? Are you feeling quite comfy? Are you just a bit indifferent? Just notice how you are. Gather that up. And yeah, do whatever you need to in the next 15 minutes. And I'll ring a bell at the end of it.
Can you just read the first one?
Sure. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Any other requests for repeats? Okay, so the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. So if you're sitting comfortably, then I'll carry on. So part 3, the fourfold vision and the mandala of awakening. Hold on to your hats. So we've looked at the golden string, vision and transformation, and we've looked a bit at the marriage of heaven and hell. Without contraries is no progression. So we need a glimpse of something big enough to encompass all our contrary energies and a path, a thread to follow, to lead us from that initial glimpse all the way through to the full integration of those energies and an arrival, in single inverted commas, at the end of the golden thread. As we know, ultimately, there is no thread, no arrival, nowhere to go, nothing to do. But we'll set that to one side at the moment because we're talking about the process of the path. And as we know, the goal is to be absolutely on the path. Energy is eternal delight, says Blake in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And as we saw earlier, it can also build a hell in heaven's despite, depending on how we see it and what we do with it. Tantric Buddhism, the Vajrayana, relates to energy very much in this way. Everything is energy. We just need to learn how to engage it, pattern it, use it skillfully. And it's quite interesting. Blake has been described as Western Tantra. Not in any literal kind of way, of course, but there's something about this exuberant, colourful nature of these late prophetic books, his works, and he's well, energy is eternal delight. That is definitely one of his watchwords, you could say. Yeah. And Blake, like Buddhism, recognised that we needed to discriminate skillfully between different kinds of energies to have a big enough perspective or awareness in which they could all come skillfully into relationship. He wouldn't have used the word like skillful, but as we see what unfolds, you'll get more of a sense of what I mean. And Blake's thinking has some very interesting parallels, I think, with Bante's perspective on the Dharma. So I should have said earlier, but I'll say it now. I mean, Blake was writing in the 18th century, and so much of what he wrote uses the word man, which obviously can be an issue for many of us, and we might sometimes substitute it for woman or being or whatever. But often when I'm quoting him, I just quote him as it is, and I think we can make our own translation. And as I said earlier, I mean, there's a whole other layer of his mythology, which I won't go into, where he does have masculine and feminine aspects to like his big archetypal figures. And there's loads more we could say about that, but we're not going to do that today. So I'm saying that because I want to talk about the fourfold man, as he says, or the fourfold being, the fourfold person. And Blake came to see that human nature was fourfold. We have a reason part, we have a kind of sensing part, an emotional part, and we have imagination. So for those familiar with Jung and Jungian personality types, this might seem strangely familiar. Well, there's an archetypal pattern here. And also Blake and Jung shared some roots in the Western mystery tradition, exploring alchemy, exploring Gnosticism, Neoplatonism. Both of them were exploring inner worlds. I mean, that image of Los going in through the gateway is stepping into the inner world. And that's so much what Jung did as well. And they were both interested, as is Bante, in discerning the patterns that emerge in such exploration. And if you think about these five spiritual faculties, the fourfold man, there's an interesting resonance with the five spiritual faculties that we talk about in Buddhism as well. But I'll come to that in a minute. So for Blake, because he had this extraordinary imagination, these different aspects of the personality became these four different figures. They're known as the four zoas. So reason is portrayed as this character Urizen. Sensing is portrayed as this character Thalmas. Emotion is portrayed as the figure of Orc or Luva. And imagination is portrayed as this figure Los that we've already seen, or Urthona. And as well as having female counterparts, they've also got a fallen and an unfallen state. There's a huge, vast amount of complexity in Blake's mythological world, which is very interesting. And Bante does talk about this a bit actually in Buddhism and William Blake. It's a shortish essay, it's really worth reading, and he makes a connection actually with the Yogacara. For those of you who have an interest in that direction, I recommend it. Anyway, if we could have the next slide. This is an image of Blake's. Just wait for our... It's all right, don't worry, Rafi. I know it's a thing, isn't it? Trying to do the screen share when everybody's watching. There's that one with the... it's a few back from that. Just keep going back. Previous one. I think if you right click, oh, that's it. There we are. So this is an image of Blake's, and isn't it interesting? Yes, Liz says a Venn diagram, but actually it's a kind of mandala, isn't it? And you can see the names of those figures. They're quite faint, but on the right you've got Luva, on the left you've got Thalmas, at the top you've got Urthona, in the red at the bottom it actually says Urizen. So he presents these figures. And this image, I mentioned earlier, Blake talks about the mundane egg. I'm not going to explain that today, but this is an image of it. Yeah, so interesting. that patterning, that mandala patterning coming through very visually here in Blake. And I've also put together a few images for 2 of these 4 figures. I thought we won't try and look at all of them, but the 2 main ones really are reason, urizen, and emotion, which is orc or luva. So I thought we'd have these to illustrate 2 of the contraries. So if we could have the next one now. So I've pinched these images from a slideshow that Triratna did on our Blake retreat. And he has these lovely quotes that he'd found as well. So Urizen, reason, hair white as snow covered him. Urizen cried, obey my voice, young demon. I am God from eternity to eternity. And he collected himself in awful pride. And then the next one is another image of him looming and and then again, another one, next one. We've got him, again, he's kind of got his arms out in a loomy kind of way. Still his books he bore in his strong hands and his iron pen. Here alone I have written the secrets of wisdom. So Urizen's this real, restrictive, kind of oppressive, rule of law, 10 commandments, very reason in a very kind of constricting kind of way. So with the next one, then we get orc. He's luva orc, mainly known as, whose emotion rending his way, a terrible child sprang forth in thunder, smoke, and sullen flames, howling fury and blood. He bursts out. There's great tension with Urizen. And the next one, a different image. So, hater of dignities, lover of wild rebellion, and transgressor of God's law, the terror answered, I am the fiery joy that Urizen perverted to 10 commands. That stony law I stamp to dust and scatter religion abroad to the 4 winds as a torn brook, and none shall gather the leaves. So orc is the spirit of revolution and rebellion. It's another one if we go to the next slide. Yeah. Just close up, yeah. I often think when I'm looking at these, I reckon Blake must have spent hours and hours and hours staring into his fire. I was on a solitary retreat a few years ago looking into the fire, and I kept thinking of these images, and it's like, oh yeah. Yeah. And then there's another one, there we are, in motion. So there's loads more we could say about these fascinating characters, but we need to move on. We did have a whole week-long retreat exploring them at Adishtan about 3 years ago. As I say, they're called the 4 Zoas, and Blake wrote many of what we call prophetic books, kind of epic poems about them and their relationships. So we have this 4-fold man, as Blake would say, and we can see from that mundane egg image, they can be thought of as a mandala, a kind of horizontal structure. You have the egg again. Next picture. Yeah, that's it. That's fine. Yeah. But Blake also put these qualities into a kind of a hierarchy of integration. So let's stop right there for a moment so that I can invite you to put aside any images that this might conjure up with some conventional power mode model of hierarchy, a kind of pyramid hierarchical model. Because Blake quite literally turns this on its head with his extraordinary perspective on the 4-fold vision. As I say, the 4-foldness relates to these 4 archetypal embodiments of reason, sensing, emotion, and imagination. And he wrote a poem about the 4-fold vision. Now I a 4-fold vision see, and a 4-fold vision is given to me. 'Tis 4-fold in supreme delight, and 3-fold in soft Beulah's light. And 2-fold always, may God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. So single vision is that realm of just dry reason. And for Blake, Newton, Bacon and Locke he was always railing against them. They were like the characters. They were a caricature of who they were as historical people, but for him, they embodied everything that was bad about just dry reason. And the thing is that this 4-fold vision, if we have the next slide, hopefully we'll see, there are these realms for Blake. So old row, bottom is single vision, just the realm of dry reason. Then you get the twofold realm, generation, which is where you've got reason and sensing. Nature, red in tooth and claw, as Blake describes it. Emotion comes in with a threefold vision, Beulah, the realm of moony Beulah, romantic love. And then for Blake, the fourfold vision is when you've got reason and sensing and emotion and imagination. When imagination comes into play, you've got this broadest, highest level, which is the fourfold vision. And for Blake, he describes that as Eden. So again, set aside any conventional Christian ideas. He's using Eden as another metaphor for kind of heaven, say, but this expanded consciousness. So reason's right at the bottom, the most constricted, the most narrow, old row. And as you go up, it gets broader and broader and more inclusive. The structure is augmentative. Each successive realm is a more expanded state of consciousness. Yeah. So when you get to this fourfold vision, that's when imagination comes in. He's the one that we saw, as I say, in the hat, entering the doorway to Jerusalem, right back at the beginning. When imagination is operational, the whole fourfold person is, as it were, unfolded. We could imagine it as the opening of a lotus. All the petals are open. And from a dharmic perspective, we could say that thus unfolded and thus undefiled, unobscured, the whole person is then able themselves to reflect, well, in fact, to become the nature of reality. Milarepa's got that lovely line, as a large image may be reflected in a small mirror. So it's like, we're totally open, able, we haven't got any closed in, restricting, defiling views. We're open with all our energies flowing through reason in a positive sense, emotion, sensing and imagination. All of us is available to be receptive to and to reflect reality, which is possibly a bit mind-blowing. And if it is a bit boggling, don't worry, just let it have its effect. We're almost done. We've had the fourfold man as a mandala. We've got the fourfold vision as this upside down pyramid. And I wanted to take a step from there into much more familiar territory, which is the 5 spiritual faculties. So if we could have the next slide. That's our theme. Oh, sorry, that was an extra one that I've just done, I think. Have you got that one as well, Rafi? Yeah, this was just spelling out narrow reason at the bottom, reason and sense desire, reason, sense, desire, and emotion, and then the 4 at the top. Just thought I'd make that as clear as possible. But hopefully the one after this, the next slide. Oh no, that brings them side by side. More sides than I remembered. We've done that anyway. Next slide. There we are. 5 spiritual faculties. So that's our theme for Sangharakshita for the year. And again, it's a kind of mandala, isn't it? These different aspects. They're not exactly the same, but they're not exactly different, are they? There are resonances. And I guess being of a pattern-minded inclination in how I approach the world, if we have the next slide, just a way of seeing. And so on the right, you've got the 5 spiritual faculties, wisdom and faith as a pair. You could say one's more cognitive, one's more emotional, and then you've got Urizen and Luva, you've got thinking and emotion. And then you've got that top and the bottom, so you've got energy, that kind of outward going faculty, Virya, and then at the bottom, Samadhi, which is more of a kind of going inwards kind of activity, and you've got a kind of parallel. I could explain it in loads more detail, but we'll be here all afternoon. But imagination, loss, and tharmas. And it's interesting to note, Blake's got the 4. What he hasn't got is mindfulness in the middle. That's what we get with the Dharma. We get the mindfulness in the middle, which brings them all into a workable relationship in a whole kind of different way. So just interesting getting that sense there are these archetypal patterns. Bhante puts the 5 spiritual faculties into that mandala pattern when he talks about them in the survey of Buddhism, and he sees that you can actually understand the different Mahayana schools as each having more of a focus either on wisdom or faith or samadhi, meditation or energy, the tantra. But I wanted us to take another peek at the upside down pyramid, if you remember. So we've got these fourfold vision, these realms, and there's another dharmic list, another dharmic model, which actually looks very similar. If we have the next slide, hopefully. Here we are. So this is Dante's presentation of the 5 levels of conditionality, the 5 niyamas. And it's so interesting because you see in that, the bottom of that, the utu niyama, which, I mean, Dante's glossed the traditional, just to say, because we always have to when we use the word niyama. Niyamas are used in a particular way in the Pali Canon. Dante's taken the spirit of how they're used and he's put modern language as a gloss on the different levels. So utu niyama is kind of physics, dead matter in the way Bhante describes it. Biology, bija niyama, interesting. It's kind of that realm of, well, like nature, really. And then you get mano niyama, where psychology starts to come in. So in a way you could say, yeah, like the emotion that we had in Blake's threefold vision. Obviously, we've got the karma niyama level with the dharma and the dharma niyama level. But I really just wanted to invite you to be aware that when Bante's visioning this, it's got that same move from something that's quite dead and single, and as the hierarchy expands and you get out to the dharma niyama, dharmakaya, you could say, there is this sense of an expansion of consciousness. The same sense of augmentation, widening with the ascent. Each bit further up becomes bigger, more inclusive, more expansive. And you could imagine even that once you keep going beyond that dharma niyama, it's like getting right out of that egg and eventually just totally out in the blue sky, just expands until there is no limit in any direction with what is unfolding in the dharma niyama, the dharmakaya. So we just have the next slide that just puts those 2 little upside down pyramids together, just as a visual. Realms is such an important thing. Bhante, I mean, the Buddhist tradition talks, and Bhante brings out again and again in his work that there just are these different levels to our experience, from more constricted through more and more and more open until ultimately utterly free. Whether we're talking about, the Brahma Viharas as higher states of mundane consciousness, or we go beyond the dhyanas into realmless realms, really, formless realms. Yeah. So I thought we'd conclude by returning to very familiar territory indeed, which is the Mandala of Awakening, or the 5 Buddha Mandala. So we have the next slide. That will be very familiar to most of you, I imagine. And again, it's the same resonance in that pattern of qualities. So we've got Akshobhya in the south, the resonance with wisdom, Amitabha. Well, he's not actually in the south, he's actually in the east, but sometimes in Buddhism, the east is in the position that we conventionally would think of as the south. How's that for confusing? But if you actually work round, you start with the blue one, wisdom, Akshobhya, go round to the yellow one, Ratnasambhava, creativity, abundance, generosity, round to Amitabha, faith, love, meditation, round to Moghasiddhi on the right, energy, unobstructed energy, and then in the middle you've got the Buddha Vairochana. Space, luminous space. So there's one other interesting parallel I'd just like to offer you to conclude. There's not just the 5 Buddhas of the 5 Buddha Mandala, there's also the 6th Buddha of the 5 Buddha Mandala. And that's the one who encompasses them all, brings them all together as the essential diamond nature, which is the essence of Shunyata. The essential diamond nature, which is the essence of Shunyata. And that is, next slide, Vajrasattva. This is a very blown up image from the top of a refuge tree. It's a bit dark, but you can see there's Vajrasattva, and then in front of him there are the five jinnas, the 5 conquerors the next slide is a clearer picture of Vajrasattva. Yeah. So he's got that crown on his head, and actually in the jewels of that crown, there are all the colours of the other Buddhas. And he kind of, one of the things he symbolises is the nature of mind. The nature of mind, which encompasses all of samsara and nirvana. So he's the kind of, he's beyond all those distinctions into those different qualities that the 5 Buddhas represent. They all come together in him. So the reason I wanted to mention this afternoon is that Blake also has a character who brings together all those 4 Zoas that we heard about. And in Blake, this character is called Albion. So let's have the next slide. So this is Albion. And this is a picture that's called Albion Rose, as in Albion rose up. And part of Blake's mythology is that Albion was asleep. And all sorts of terrible things happened because Albion was asleep. He wasn't awake. When Albion rose, this is also called Glad Day. And as Pranimati was saying only this morning, it actually does look a bit like a mandala, doesn't it, with all those colours behind him. And Albion is Blake's great image for the complete reunification and reintegration of all those, Blake would say, fallen energies. I mean, there's a whole thing about the fall, which is a whole other story. Again, lots of other stories today. But each of the Zoas has a female counterpart. They all come together, and Albion has his counterpart in Jerusalem. So we've got one more image, I think, which is the image one image of Blake's of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's also an image of the holy city. As I say, that verse that we had at the start. I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. Next slide. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, set in Jerusalem's wall. So true liberty, to exercise the divine art of imagination, expand one's consciousness, exploring inward, to enter, or rather re-enter, eternity. And final slide. So we've come full circle back to where we began, although of course we haven't, because we're somewhere else now entirely. And we haven't been anywhere. So I realised that I planned this thinking we were going to finish at 5, and then I looked at the website and discovered we said we were going to finish at 4:30. So I think what we might need to do is try something a bit experimental and turn the screen around and see if we can have the last 15 minutes together. It might be complete mayhem, but just a chance for us to be together and say anything else we want to say, gather up anything else we want to gather up. I'm sorry, we won't, because of the time thing, we haven't got time for another 15-minute reflection and then coming together, but hopefully that's workable with. So I'm going to try and move things around now. Yeah, if you stop.